The summit on Eryndor Station was never meant to feel welcoming. It was designed to feel neutral: sterile corridors, symmetrical halls, carefully balanced lighting that avoided favoring any species' visual spectrum. Every detail was engineered to minimize cultural bias and prevent any one delegation from gaining psychological advantage. For decades, it had hosted negotiations between species that shared little beyond mutual distrust. Wars had been prevented here, others had been prolonged. This time, the agenda was different. A multi-species peace accord, one that would unify trade routes, stabilize contested sectors, and establish shared protocols for resource distribution. On paper, the conditions were favorable. In practice, the delegations arrived already divided. Suspicion ran deep. Accusations had circulated before the summit even began. Each side believed the others had violated prior agreements. Each delegation entered the chamber with grievances that had not been resolved, only delayed. The atmosphere reflected it. No greetings beyond protocol. No informal exchanges. Just guarded posture and carefully measured statements. To the assembled leaders, compromise felt less like cooperation and more like concession. And in the middle of it all stood a human, Chef Adrian Hale. He had been invited not as a negotiator, but as a culinary representative, tasked with preparing a shared dining experience for the summit delegates. The idea was simple: a neutral meal, designed to represent common ground. Food, after all, was one of the few experiences that could transcend language. At least that was the theory. Among the delegates, the invitation had been met with indifference at best. Some had openly dismissed the concept. Human cuisine, they argued, lacked refinement compared to the structured nutrient systems used by advanced species. Others questioned its safety. A few considered it irrelevant entirely. Still, the protocol required participation. So when the designated meal session began, the delegates assembled in the central dining chamber, seated according to prearranged diplomatic hierarchy. Adrian stood at the head of the room, observing quietly as the final preparations were completed. The meal was brought in through automated service units. Multiple courses, each adapted to accommodate varied biological requirements while maintaining a cohesive presentation. As the dishes were placed before each delegation, subtle reactions began to emerge. Confusion, hesitation, dismissal. One delegate examined the plate in front of them and exchanged a glance with their counterpart. "This is what they consume?" one of them asked, tone layered with skepticism. Another leaned closer to inspect the contents. "It appears unprocessed." A third added, "Primitive." The comments were not loud, but they were not private either. Adrian heard them. He said nothing. Instead, he waited. The first delegates began sampling the meal. Tentatively, reluctantly, the initial reactions varied. Some adjusted quickly. Others paused. A few set their utensils down, not because of the quality of the food, but because of the expectations they had brought with them. Adrian stepped forward slightly. "Before conclusions are made," he said calmly, "I'd like you to try something together." The room quieted. He gestured toward the center table, where a shared dish had been placed, intended for communal sampling. "Not individually," he continued. "Together." There was a brief hesitation. Then, slowly, representatives from different delegations moved toward the central table. Not out of trust, but curiosity, they gathered around the shared dish. Adrian stepped back, allowing them space. No instructions, no interference, just observation. One delegate initiated the first serving. Another followed, then another. At first, the interaction was procedural, but as they began to engage with the meal side by side, something subtle shifted. Conversation emerged. Not formal negotiation, not structured debate, simple commentary. "This preparation is more balanced than expected. The texture is consistent. Your species uses similar combinations in ceremonial contexts?" A response followed. "Yes, though typically with different ratios." The tone of the room began to change. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The shared act of eating created a moment of parallel experience. For the first time since arriving, delegates were not positioned across from each other as opponents. They were side by side, engaging with the same stimuli, reacting in real time. Adrian didn't interrupt the emerging exchanges. He simply ensured the meal continued. Course after course was presented, each designed with intentional neutrality, not favoring any specific cultural palate, but instead emphasizing adaptability and balance. As the meal progressed, the tone of discussion shifted further. Delegates began referencing their own systems, their own methods of preparation, their own assumptions about others, not as accusations but as points of comparison. One delegate admitted, "We were led to believe your methods were inefficient." Another responded, "Our data suggested similar about yours." Pause followed. Not uncomfortable, just reflective. Adrian observed quietly. because what was unfolding was not part of the official agenda. It was not recorded in diplomatic briefs, but it was real. The assumptions that had shaped the conflict, misinformation, partial data, and reinforced narratives began to lose rigidity when confronted with direct, shared experience. Food, in this context, was not just sustenance. It was exposure, a controlled environment where perception could be tested without the pressure of formal negotiation. By the time the final course was served, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted significantly. Delegates who had entered the room with rigid positions now engaged in conversation that extended beyond the meal itself. Not agreements, not yet, but understanding, clarification, correction of misconceptions. Small steps that, in diplomatic contexts, often matter more than immediate outcomes. After the meal concluded, the delegates returned to the formal chamber. This time the tone was different, not fully aligned, not fully resolved, but no longer entirely adversarial. When discussions resumed, references to the shared experience began to surface, not as persuasion, but as context. Statements like, "We observed during the meal that our assumptions about your methods were incomplete," or, "The exchange we had earlier suggests there may be gaps in our prior assessments." These were not concessions. They were openings. And openings in diplomacy are where progress begins. Hours later, when preliminary agreements were drafted, several delegates requested revisions, not to weaken their positions, but to reflect newly acknowledged realities. The foundation of the accord remained complex. Compromises were still required. Disputes were not erased overnight. But something fundamental had changed. The participants were no longer operating solely on inherited narratives. They had shared an experience that challenged those narratives directly. As the summit concluded for the day, one delegate approached Adrian before leaving the chamber. Not formally, not as part of protocol, but personally. "You were correct," they said. Adrian nodded slightly. "About what?" The delegate gestured toward the dining hall. "That understanding doesn't begin with agreements." A pause. "It begins with something shared." Adrian didn't respond immediately. Then he said simply, "Meals are just one way to start." The delegate considered that for a moment, then left. In the official records of the summit, the meal session would be listed as a scheduled cultural exchange. A supporting event. Not the centerpiece. Not the turning point. But those present understood something that wouldn't appear in any transcript. Before negotiations can succeed, perception has to change. And sometimes, the most unexpected path to peace doesn't begin with arguments or treaties. It begins when people sit at the same table and realize they've been wrong about each other all along.